Hello, and welcome to Real Mindful. This is where we speak mindfully about things that matter. We meet here twice a month to introduce you to some of the teachers, thinkers, writers, and researchers who are engaged in the mindfulness movement. You'll hear all kinds of conversations here about the science of mindfulness, the practice of mindfulness, and the heart of it. And if you've been a listener of Point of View with Barry Boyce, you've come to the right place. Barry is our guest today, as a matter of fact. I'm Stephanie Domet. I'm the managing editor at Mindful Magazine and mindful.org, and this is Real Mindful. Barry Boyce is the founding editor of Mindful and mindful.org, and in every issue of the magazine, he writes the back page column Point of View. Barry has a deep mindfulness practice developed over decades and is the author of the book The Mindfulness Revolution. And he dropped by my place on a cool fall day recently to tell me about a trip he took, pre-pandemic, to Washington, D.C. to visit a pair of Smithsonian museums. He wrote about his visit to the National Museum of African American History and Culture in the winter 2020 issue of Mindful, and in the October issue of this year, which is on stands now, Barry wrote about his visit to the National Museum of the American Indian. And he and I recorded this conversation just after Canada's first official National Truth and Reconciliation Day, and this episode is coming to you just after National Indigenous Peoples Day in the United States. Barry Boyce, hello.
Hello, Steph. Nice to be doing this again.
Nice to see you in person for once.
Yeah. It's lovely.
A rare treat.
A rare treat in the pandemic world of Zooming.
Indeed. And in the pre-pandemic world, you had an incredible opportunity to go to Washington, D.C. and tour a couple of the Smithsonian museums and write about them for Mindful. And I want you to tell me all about going to I think it's called the Museum of the Native American Indian.
I think it's the Museum of the American Indian, I believe. Well, let's start there. First of all, it was, I'd been hearing about the National Museum of the American Indian since it first opened. Lots of people telling me great things about the building and the exhibits there. And also, later on, the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and I visited, and I made a special trip to visit both of them, and it was really quite a wonderful experience, and it made me feel good about America, that these museums exist and that people could go there, and walk in for free and see these wonderful exhibits. So, first off, I should talk about, the anachronism of calling it the American Indian. Obviously, that's a heavily weighted, freighted term, and but at the time they put the museum together, it was still the term of art in the U.S. Rather than Native Americans or First Nations or Indigenous people. But those are terms that I would prefer. And to talk about Indigenous peoples and indigeneity. And so, anyway, yeah, it was a great visit. One of the first things that hits you is the architecture, right out, just looking at the building itself. It's designed by Douglas Cardinal. So Douglas Cardinal is an Indigenous Canadian architect who did the incredible Museum of History, which sits across the Rideau River from Parliament Hill in Ottawa.
A phenomenal museum.
Yeah, phenomenal museum. Just a really special place, and inside and out. And the very much having a curvaceous, organic, earthy feel to it, and the inside and the outside communicating with each other. So Cardinal did something similar with this wonderful building in Washington, D.C. And there's a wetland there right outside the museum, which is
amazing.
Kind of interesting that, the mall in Washington is this kind of very, all the buildings are white and Greco-Roman and, big lawns, and this is a distinctly different environment right from the beginning. And it's very interesting about all those bright white marble buildings. They're based on Greek and Roman models, but it's well known that those buildings in Greece were brightly painted.
Right.
They were painted bright colors. But when they were discovered, later, or what lasted later, obviously that had all been washed away and bleached away. So this kind of architecture is a bleached version bleached white version of what, the Greeks and, as far as I understand it, probably the Romans had. So this building has a lot of color and a lot of feeling of earthiness, not the kind of staid and manicured feeling of the rest of the mall.
So even on the approach, you can see that you're going to have quite a different experience in this building than you might have in any of those other official buildings on the mall.
Yeah, it changes your experience right off the bat. And as I wrote about about the National Museum of African American History and Culture, while it's a striking building from the outside, where you start alters your experience immediately because you start deep in the basement and as if you're entering the middle passage, and it's very striking. The National Museum of the American Indian, just as you're saying, it transforms your what you're seeing and your worldview, if you will. It shifts it even just as you approach the building. And when you go inside, there are no corners.
No corners.
There are no corners whatsoever. I mean, there may be the odd corner here or there that you'd have to work to find, but it's all curvaceous. And, I think it's a principle of biology that nature doesn't do right
angles.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
I love that so much because I imagine the ways in which it must be like subtly and also not subtly working on your own perceptions to suddenly be in this built environment that's mimicking nature in that way, because so few of our built environments do that.
And it's interesting, you see how nature erupts sidewalks and roads, houses, and they start going curvy.
Yeah, that's right. Everything goes curvy.
Everything goes curvy. So you feel that immediately, and the museum recommends now that some of these exhibits may change by the time you get there, but you can do a lot of visiting online. The first place they direct you to is the Cosmologies, which is on the top floor. And it's just, you see all these different versions of the medicine wheel. And, when we think of cosmology, we think of so often the word conveys something that's happening far off in space.
Yeah, in the some people would call them in the heavens, right?
The heavens, the cosmos is this big thing, and then we're here leading our regular lives. So, in indigenous cosmologies, Earth and heaven are intimately connected. The cosmos is here and all surrounding us as well, and you understand your place to be not a position of control, but of stewardship for a time. You know, you are a steward of the plant life, the animal life. You are subject to the weather and the environment, and you adapt how you behave to that. So
rather than trying to control it in the ways that we love to think that we can, right?
Yeah, to
subvert it and control it,
or
contain
overcome
it.
and,
Yeah.
You know, like right now, you know, Las Vegas has had to get rid of lawns.
Right.
Because, you know, Las Vegas was filled with all these lawns.
Yeah, which is incongruous in a desert.
Completely incongruous and using up loads of water.
Resource intensive.
And a classic example of not being in touch with and adapting to and, you know, being a steward of the land. And in this era, we have an awful lot to learn about that. So I was very moved. I mean, it's not as if I went in there not knowing about any of these things before, but to be immersed in it for like about an hour. I mean, I could have been in there much longer. It just, you know, there's only so much time. But and each of the cosmologies in there were different, but there was a continuity in terms of the basic medicine wheel that, you know, looks at the world in terms of directions and animals and colors, and it sees things in a very holistic and global way. I want to say something too about traditions and maybe you might say spirituality, that, you know, it's the spirituality in the sense of people who grow up on the land, there's a natural spirituality that comes along with that. You know, what is your relationship with heaven and earth and the other beings around you? So it's about spirituality, not necessarily religion.
You connect this in your column in the issue of the magazine with awe, right?
Yeah.
You talk about Dr. Keltner and awe and our capacity for that and its place in our lives.
Yeah, awe is a kind of you might say, a spiritual experience of the most straightforward type. It just, wow. There's something way bigger, and I'm integrated into it. Yeah,
it's an incredible feeling.
Yeah, and it can just overtake you in a second. Sometimes around the magazine we talk about woo-woo.
We do.
And our wariness of it, and a lot of people are wary of what you would call woo-woo, and I want to say what we mean by that and what we don't mean by that. I think it's important to make that distinction. So what we mean by that is a simplistic notion that by meditating for a couple of minutes, sudden transformations are going to take place, and you're going to hear the music of the spheres, and you know,
the secrets of the universe will be revealed.
Yes, exactly. That stuff that, you know, just feels like it's an overpromise and sort of a shortcut past doing the work of actually having to settle down and be in the here and now, noticing others, noticing what's going on in your body and mind, and then seeing what emerges from that. Rather than taking some kind of shortcut to an airy-fairy, promised kind of place.
When I used to work in a bookstore, there was a book that was in hot demand called The Lazy Man's Guide to Enlightenment.
There you go. Yeah. However, indigenous spirituality is not woo-woo. That's not what we're referring to. And I'll give you a pretty good example, I think. My Celtic ancestors had, by all evidence, an incredible spirituality, Druid culture, and some kind of a hermitage culture. You know, I visited some of the hermitage caves that in the pre-Christian era people meditated in, or whatever they did in pre-Christian times in Ireland. And at the same time, there are all sorts of books and things promoting Celtic spirituality, but for the most part, the direct line from people who practice those things has pretty much been lost. So what you're getting is something that somebody's making up.
Yeah.
What I imagine it would be like.
Right.
And that's doesn't work so well, because you're not connected to a real tradition.
Right. That authenticity, receiving those teachings, being part of that kind of lineage, for instance, all of that.
Exactly. And,
yeah.
What keeps it grounded.
Yeah.
Rather than fantastical and,
corruptible, perhaps even.
Made up in your imagination and woo-woo.
Right.
That's why preserving indigenous traditions and spirituality is important. Many of them are still intact, some just barely, so one can connect with it in an authentic way. And whether one practices these or not, one can learn about them, even just going and seeing these different cosmologies. And I think remembering, no matter how much we've built up our world and how proud we are of all our institutions, or how disappointed we are in all our incredible institutions and technologies, we're still here on Earth. We still eat. The food still comes out of the dirt. The dirt still has to be fed by rain.
We're nature.
Yeah.
We can be easily convinced that we're separate from nature, but we are intrinsically, we're part of it. It's part of us.
And I think that's wisdom we need to connect to, and that sense of awe that indigenous peoples preserve, and in many cases are trying to return to. We just celebrated the first Truth and Reconciliation Day, also known as Orange Shirt Day in Canada, to celebrate indigenous peoples, to also be clear about the attempts to eradicate that kind of world, and what we all need to do going forward. So I think with what's going on with the climate and the resource burden that we've put on the planet, and the heights of technology we've reached, not really bringing us into the new golden age. I think indigeneity will be an important phenomenon for us all to relate to.
And for you as a longtime mindfulness practitioner, I mean, bells must have been ringing left, right, and center for you. I'm imagining there was deep resonance in what you were seeing in the museum and your mindfulness practice.
Very much so. I think mindfulness is not a cultural practice per se, while many of the practices were developed, highly developed and advanced in Asian cultures. Any mindfulness practice is drawing on a basic human capability we have, and it connects us to Earth and to our environment and to where we are now. And indigenous practices have that kind of innate, inherent mindfulness about them, and I definitely connected with that. And you know, it's interesting to keep learning about indigenous practices such as storytelling that have a mindfulness component to them, that are really true mindfulness practices.
So once you spent some time in awe on the cosmology's level, then what happened to you in that museum?
Yeah, well, then the next place I went to was sort of a shock in the other direction. It was, I went to a wonderful exhibit, quite detailed exhibit about treaties.
Aha.
And again, I knew a bit going in, but I learned more while I was there. And I think one of the most significant things to appreciate is that indigenous peoples had been making treaties amongst themselves for a long time. It's well known that indigenous peoples in ancient times, went to war over territory. Human beings do this. They have done this. They are doing it now.
Yes.
They also, like human beings everywhere, also understood the need for peace and coexistence. So their approach to treaties was a little bit different. It was more ceremonial and ritualistic, and in the ceremony was not just a signing of a document, but it was intended to be something that would be regularly renewed.
Right, these are living documents, right? This is a living relationship.
It's a living relationship, and the document is secondary to it.
Right. For instance, we're recording this on Treaty Day here in Nova Scotia, and this is a day where, all of us here, we're all treaty people, and this is a day where we kind of renew our relationship, renew our agreement.
Yeah, and that wasn't necessarily the approach that the European tradition had been developing.
Right.
They saw themselves as acquiring land on behalf of a monarchy.
More of a transaction, perhaps.
More of a transaction. And it was a culture clash. I think it's important, if you go to such an exhibit or read about these things, you reach your own conclusions. I'm not trying to argue about evil and good here.
Sure.
I'm talking about a very sad clash of cultures where the European understanding ended up not in a joint stewardship, but in an eventual near obliteration, and in some cases, obliteration. Sometimes, and in many cases, there was definitely ill intent, for sure, in the extreme. It's just a sad outcome. It was really, when you look at it, there were two groups seeing different worlds.
Right.
Just in the same way I talked about the cosmologies, I think we could learn how relationships need renewal. We need a sense of ritual. We need to understand that just because we sign on the dotted line, that doesn't tell the whole story. We're a culture supposedly of laws, but we have many broken rituals around how those agreements are carried out. And we need to remember that it's about face-to-face relationships in the end. And, in our cultures today, we often try to avoid the face-to-face relationship. Let's do it through our documents and through our lawyers. And, it creates... look at all the polarity that can be generated by people being able to yell at each other without doing it face to face.
Oh, yes. We're emboldened in different ways when we don't have to actually see the other person and acknowledge their humanity, right?
Yeah, and go through the ritual of working out our relationship, which is what failed all those centuries ago, and that we live with that legacy of those treaties being corrupted from the get-go.
When I think about this, this way that these agreements or these relationships are, intended to be alive, I think of being married. My spouse and I stood in front of our friends and family and made certain promises to each other, and then we were legally married, and we remain legally married, but it wasn't that day of making those promises that is our marriage. It's every day, we are agreeing to continue in relationship with each other.
That's beautiful. That's exactly the thing that I felt that, it's a perfect analogy to the treaty situation. One thing I've always felt about marriages, when you get married, you're not going to have one marriage. You're going to have many marriages.
Every day, new marriage.
Yeah, new marriage. And you wake up one day and, we're in a new marriage.
Here we are now.
It's different. You know. You may, for example, you may turn into the caregiver for your spouse. Something you didn't, 35, 40 years ago, that wasn't something you were thinking about at that time. Treaties, a real treaty needs to take into account an organic, ongoing relationship of sharing something, and we can learn a lot from that sense. And to do it ritually, to have rituals like we do,
to be able
marriage.
To revisit, right? Every year on our anniversary,
the peace pipe, whatever it is. So the final place that I went to a few more places, but the most significant place I went to in the museum was an exhibit about, there was a two-part exhibit about how Native Americans had been run off their land and moved, in one case, in what's known as the Trail of Tears, and then what resulted was a caricature of Native American culture that shows up there's a room in the museum that's cathedral-like space, and it's just filled with logos, everything from cigarettes and candy and tobacco,
motorcycles
and flour and
sports teams.
Yeah, you name it. So now we're beginning to see those kinds of changes take place, where there's some recognition of, You said, what's wrong with calling a motorcycle the Indian? Well, what's problematic is how it trivializes somebody's cultural heritage. And so, the Cleveland Indians have finally changed their name.
Yeah.
And we're going to see more of that. And of course, people say, this is politically correct. Why does it even matter? It matters if it hurts somebody. Why bother? What's the point of... So you're attached to the name of your team, but at the expense of hurting somebody, and you say, well, they're overly sensitive. Well, I don't know. When you consider that a culture that has been subject to obliteration, I think that would make one sensitive.
There's a sort of, I think, an ironic tension in that act of, near obliteration or obliteration, and then replacing with this romanticized or cartoonized image of a culture that has been obliterated or near obliterated, right? Like that.
Well, it places a filter between you coming from outside that culture and the actual culture itself. Mm-hmm. So, the culture itself is, the medicine wheel, the connection with earth and heaven, with the weather, with animals, with plants, how to be of this place. So the cosmos is right here. And the cartoon version, the romanticized cartoon version, hides you from that.
Yeah.
And, I think it's changing and much farther to go. I think as we wrap up, it's natural to ask, well, what does this have to do with mindfulness?
I mean, I usually ask the questions here, but I'll allow it. What does this have to do with mindfulness?
So, are you asking, what does this have to do with mindfulness, Steph?
Barry Boyce, I am.
Okay, that's a brilliant question. As we questionees so often say, that's an excellent question.
Excellent question, we say.
Question, Stephanie. Well, mindfulness is personal, obviously we talk about mindfulness for stress reduction, for focus, for working with anxiety, for working with pain, any number of personal issues immediate to ourselves. And that, no matter how long you do mindfulness, that will forever remain a part of your practice, that you tune your own instrument, so to speak. But over time, mindfulness also becomes very much about how do I perceive others? Do I really see them? Do I see through what I'm projecting onto them to actually see them and what's going on with them? Am I curious enough to let go of assumptions for a while and see what's there, to enter into dialogue and relationship? And I think that the messages of stewardship and connection to earth and heaven that indigenous traditions bring to us as part of our legacy here is very much about mindfulness and awareness, and valuable for us to learn from. Right now, we live in a world where we have a number of overlapping cultures. And it can be very confusing for us nowadays. And I think that confusion is a good thing. If somebody asks me, well, take a survey, what's your culture?
Oh.
What's your culture? Well, I don't know. I grew up eating a particular kind of food because I grew up, Irish and Scottish, but I have friends who share a similar culture, the same songs, but they grew up eating different food. The way they hug each other is different. And, we have all these divides based on histories of oppression and poverty, marginalization, race, you name it. We need to negotiate these. This is big, because the mindfulness movement, as it moves into the future, will not be worth much if it's just about a personal bubble.
Yeah.
It's going to have to be about relationships and culture and navigating this confusing, chaotic landscape of so many overlapping cultures. And I look forward to being a part of that work.
Barry Boyce, always a pleasure to chat with you.
Great. Thanks, Steph.
As Barry mentioned, you can visit the Museum of the American Indian in person in Washington, D.C., with some COVID safety protocols in place, of course, and you can find all the details about those on the museum's website. While you're on the website, you'll also find all kinds of resources, including a look at some of those treaties that Barry talked about, and the exhibit that shows images and iconography of Indigenous people in popular culture and advertising. So even if you can't make it to the museum in person, you can still have an experience of some of what it offers online. And we'll pop a link to that in our show notes so that you can navigate over there with ease. And you can read more about Barry's visit in his Point of View column in the October issue of Mindful, or find it at mindful.org. Now, if you enjoyed this episode of Real Mindful, perhaps you would leave us a review. You can find us in all the usual places where you find your favorite podcasts. You can subscribe from there if you like, or, as I say, leave a review. Your review helps other listeners decide whether Real Mindful is right for them. We'd also love to hear from you. You can let us know what you thought of what you heard on Real Mindful, or suggest a topic or guest for a future episode by writing to us at yourwords@mindful.org. Before I let you go, we also have a weekly practice podcast called 12-Minute Meditation. The latest neuroscientific research reveals that about 12 minutes of meditation a day can be enough to yield amazing benefits like increased focus, clarity, calm, and compassion. And you know us, we're always keen to help you with all of that. So each week on that podcast, we deliver a fresh mindfulness practice directly to your ears from a leading mindfulness expert. And you can subscribe to 12-Minute Meditation, again, wherever you find your favorite podcasts. We'll be back with another episode of Real Mindful soon. Until then, may all your days offer opportunities for awe.